Hello everyone to this webinar. The Transforming Education Summit was convened in September 2022 in response to a global crisis in education, one of equity and inclusion, quality and relevance. Often slow and unseen, this crisis is having devastating impact on the futures of children and youth worldwide. The summit provided a unique opportunity to elevate education to the top of the global political agenda and to mobilize action, ambition, solidarity, and solutions to recover pandemic-related learning losses and sow the seeds to transform education in a rapidly changing world. Among the subjects addressed by the world leaders, digital learning and transformation. And to tell us more about this relevant topic, I am glad to welcome Dr. Patrick Paul Walsh. Patrick Paul Walsh is currently on secondment to UN SDSN as Vice President of Education and Director the SDG Academy. He remains a full professor of international development studies. He is also an instructor for Harvard Extension School teaching foundations of sustainable development. His current research is on many aspects of the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Welcome, Dr. Walsh.
Thank you for your kind invitation. Um, so I'm going to do. I don't know whether it's a difficult task, but I'm certainly going to just review a little bit about the process behind the Transforming Education Summit. Talk a little bit about the pre-summit, but my main focus will be on the actual summit, which happened during the General Assembly week this year on September 16th, 17th, and 19th. So 16th was around mobilizing youth, basically, and the youth declaration. The 17th was what they call Solutions Day, but it really was kind of a classical side events day where you had ministers of education sitting down with the stakeholders, let's call them, the UN agencies, civil society, the universities, school teachers, and so on. So it was a stakeholder day, basically. And then the 19th was for leaders. And this was, at the end of the day, they were looking for leaders to make commitments towards education, transforming education. And that was kind of the goal. The only thing I'd say in terms of reviewing, was this a success or not? Because this is the question we want to look at. And in particular, I will zone in on track 4, which is the digital learning and transformation action track and action plan. But it's just the first thing to say is that this is a process. So starting just to realize that UNESCO are basically in the lead for education for sustainable development, and they have a 2030 framework. They also have an Education for Sustainable Development 2030 network. So if you go to UNESCO, you can look at a roadmap to 2030. You can also look at their network and you can join up and get lots of interesting information. And just to say that when the General Secretary had a vision statement, which I'll talk about in a minute, he made it clear that this was not the end. This was really just the beginning, and that there would be a UN Summit of the Future in 2024, where education would have quite a high profile. So, there's a lot of work to be done between September 22 and September 24, so we do look forward to getting some actions, if you like, coming from the planning and the dialogues and the discussions and the commitments that happened at the TEST or Transforming Education Summit a few weeks ago. So in a way, it's not that we were looking for definitive outcomes. We realize we're on a pathway. We realize that this was a moment in time to take stock, to make plans, to have commitments, but actually we're working towards the Summit of the Future in 24, and we're working towards obviously 2030 in the UNESCO ESD 2030 framework, and it involves the UNESCO ESD 2030 network. Okay. So just as an introduction to who I am, so I'm an economist and I'm on secondment from University College Dublin, and my role now in UN SDSN is looking after the education portfolio. And I just want to say, here is the SDG Academy. And if you take a photograph of that code there, you will get our annual report. So if you just want to see exactly what we've done over the last academic year, take a photograph and you'll get the URL for the report, and hopefully you'll enjoy reading it. What the SDG Academy is that SDSN itself, under the auspices of the UN General Secretary, was set up in 2012. And this was largely at the time, it was to overview an academic and legal overview of the work programs of the post-2015 process. Now we're a think tank for the UN that is into implementation and mobilizing academics to implement the SDG agenda at all levels of governance, meaning global, regional, national, local, but also all stakeholders, meaning corporates and civil society and academia itself, of course. But in 2014, it was felt that, we had these 17 goals and we had these means of implementation, we had the follow-up and review plan, but we did need to, people had to go back to school. And this is going to be a big message from today as well, that, most of us didn't have sustainable development education. Those of us who work in government, even academia, civil society, corporates, we just don't have sustainable development education. And for that reason, Jeffrey Sachs at the time felt that we did need to start producing what we call open education resources on sustainable development. And that brought us on a pathway to have these what we call online courses that are open and free on edX. And if you want to see the 40 or so courses, you can go in and have a look at the sdgacademy.org. And, lots of excellent courses there. The one that's doing particularly well is, they're all doing particularly well, but in terms of, sure, I'll let you go in and I'll pick the free courses that you'd like yourself. So one thing maybe you want to have a look at is, for one of the first times we've issued what's called a professional certificate, where we've put Rockstrom's course on planetary boundaries and Jeffrey Sachs's course in Age of Sustainable Development. And if you want to go back to school and you want to update yourself as a kind of a primer to understanding the Paris Agreement and SDGs, it's really worth doing the professional certificate. And that's something that we just issued a few weeks ago. So please go on and have a look at that. The other activity which relates obviously to the Transforming Education Summit is that SDSN and SDG Academy is a secretariat to what's called Mission 4.7. So this is SDG target 4.7. And it's an interesting one because it basically says we have to have sustainable development education in lifelong learning, from preschool all the way up K-12 into kind of what we call primary, secondary, or you might call elementary, up to high school, and including higher level, and up and into upskilling and reskilling or skilling up on sustainable development. If you're in, say, the private sector, if you're in NGOs, if you're in government. So there has to be this continuum of lifelong learning. And it's very much, saying that the problem is that it's all very fine going to school and having access to school and curriculum and good teachers, but in the content, we basically have to know how we live with nature and how we live with other human beings on this planet, right? So it is quite remarkable that we're so dependent on water and clean air and nutritious food, so dependent on nature and biodiversity in general, and the ocean, the health of the ocean. But most of us really have to go back to school to really understand how we coexist with nature. And we should be learning this from preschool all the way up into university. But unfortunately, most of us missed that. So we should really go back to school and learn how we coexist with nature. But this is also true for leaders in corporations and universities and governments, that there is a real deficit of knowledge in terms of how humanity coexists with nature and how we coexist with humans on around the planet as well, in terms of our everyday dependency on each other and on planet. And Mission 4.7 really captures that, where we really have to have that continuum of education on sustainable development. And it's a partnership with the SDSN, with the Ban Ki-moon Center, with UNESCO, the Center for Sustainable Development in Columbia University, and so on. Before I go into tests, which I will, this is a paper I wrote, or it's not a paper, it's just a little article in a magazine, let's call it, for the International Association of Universities, which was set up under the auspices of UNESCO. And this is just to remind myself in a lot of ways how we should have what's called a global science commons. And let's relabel that the global knowledge commons. So let's say we have knowledge for, or that we should have knowledge for sustainable development at all levels of schooling and all levels of lifelong learning. But there's just 3 points to be made here. First, any knowledge we have is really not free or accessible. So we do have paywalls, and this is one issue we're going to address. Maybe hopefully the technology and digital transformation can address that. We don't have open education resources. We have to understand that, right? There's normally a paywall, like school books. You pay for school books, etc. The other thing is that the knowledge that's currently there, it might be good for STEM, for science and technology and mathematics, etc. But it's not particularly orientated to the public good or to sustainable development education. So we actually, we can say we want curriculum in schools and we want curriculum in universities and curriculum for corporates, for ESG and so on, but it's not clear that the curriculum is there, and it has to be created. And so that sort of knowledge base has to be actually created, and we have to do a good bit of work. But the bottom line is that when that knowledge is there, it has to be free to create and to put up and free to access. In other words, open science for knowledge for the SDGs. And this should be embedded in HE and higher education institutes at a norm. And you've got to understand that higher education institutions are not only responsible for curriculum in the university, they also get involved with government in creating curriculum for lower levels of schooling. And they do get involved with corporates as well to actually do professional training, whether it's engineers or whether it's social workers or lawyers, etc. Universities are involved in the professional training, and they would have to embed sustainable development in that type of curriculum as well. And indeed, they're involved in public administration training. So in other words, the training of civil servants and government folks as well. So universities and the academics are quite central to creating open content in terms of curriculum, but also responsible for actually creating content that's orientated towards the SDGs. The other second thing is that to create a safe operating space for humanity, there's no point only the top 200 universities in the world or the top 10 countries in the world having this content and having access to this content, because that's not going to do anything to anyone. We actually need to build capacities in middle and low income countries, and we have to disseminate that knowledge. So if we have a knowledge commons, that we actually need a knowledge commons that's shared, and it's easily shared right across the globe. And I'm going to talk about how you potentially can do that, the digital infrastructures that potentially can do that. But the capacities have to be there then to translate into local languages, translate into local contexts and cultures, etc. And that's a key aspect as well. So when we create this global knowledge commons, we have to be aware that this has to be accessible to Africa, South America, Asia, Europe, and North America. All regions of the world, the Middle East, have to be able to access in the 6, say UN languages, for example, and it has to be disseminated easily, because it have all that knowledge concentrated in say rich universities or well-resourced universities in the top billion people who have most of the money, and then not just in Europe and US, that this will not help create a safe operating space for humanity. And finally, universities and HEAs, higher education institutes, they have to understand that we're in an existential crisis. We're in an emergency. So the climate emergency and biodiversity and ocean health emergency is as serious as the COVID-19 emergency that we have. And we really have to disseminate that knowledge very fast into corporates, into governments, and into civil society, into households, because, and again, we have to work at that. Knowledge will not find its way into the stakeholders if it's not purposely put there and you build the right platforms and you do the right training, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a lot of work to do, but it just stresses that we are not really in a good place when it comes to the amount of knowledge that we have for sustainable development. And we're certainly not making it open and free to all. We're certainly not disseminating it to other universities and higher education institutes around the world. And we're certainly not working hard in disseminating that into corporates, governments, and civil society. So there's a bit of work to be done in terms of that kind of global knowledge commons, and for it to be effective. So to come to the Transforming Education Summit, so I first point you to the vision statement, which is up on the website. I don't have it here on the slide, but Antonio Guterres has a vision statement that he published up on the TESS, the UN TESS.org website, and he called it the political imperative for our collective future. And this is sustainable development education. So basically, you know, when we went in the pre-summit, but particularly in New York, when we were looking at some nice speeches from the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, and the Director of UNESCO, etc. I mean, everyone seems to agree, and if we all sat back and thought about it, you know, what if we want peace in this world, what would be the most important thing we could do? And it's invest in education. If we want to be able to collectively cooperate on achieving the Paris Agreement or solving climate warming, it's education. If we want to, so we can write down all the ills of the world, and we all would agree that a more educated population in each and every country would deliver us probably a pathway to peace and a pathway to sustainable development. The problem is we're very far away from that, right? In the sense that what was pointed out, it says that, you know, education, while it could be the great enabler, at the moment is the great divider, right? In the sense that if you go to low to middle income countries, 70% of the population of the youth, or 70% of the youth age 10, this is what UNESCO pointed out, 70% could not read or write, right? 10-year-olds in lower to middle income countries. In terms of completion rates in secondary school, the completion rates across lots of countries is less than 50%, right? So this idea of full enrollment in primary school and completion in primary school, you know, that maybe was achievable, one of the MDG goals, but the completion rates in secondary level or high school level are certainly very low. And the thing, you know, for people coming from academia, we've got to remember that universities, the reason why universities existed in the first place was for professional development, right? So, for example, you went there to be a doctor, the professional pillars, right? You went there to be a teacher, you went there to be a social worker, you went there to be a lawyer, and these are the professional pillars of universities. And if you think of the participation rates in universities in a lot of countries, which is, you know, less than 1% or less than 3%, this is not good for the future of politics, society, or the economy, right? To have such a low participation in higher education. And even though that wasn't mentioned in Guterres' speech, you could paint a very dark picture, basically, in terms of the depth and scope of education across the world. And given that everyone would admit that this would be the great enabler, unfortunately, it is actually the great divider in terms of progress on political, social, economic, and environmental issues across the world. In terms of the things that Guterres says, very briefly, we have to rethink content. So as I said before, we don't really have content that shows us how to live with nature or live with each other, and he pointed that out. We don't really have content where we have skills that, you know, teach us critical thinking, teach us kindness, teach us empathy for others, teach us understanding for others. So in terms of actually, you know, being good global citizens, in terms of embedding information about sustainable development and sustainable development pathways, there is a huge amount of work to be done in terms of creating the curriculum at all levels of schooling. And of course, that curriculum has to be interoperable, like it has to build from preschool all the way up in the different levels in university and lifelong learning. So this is not an easy task. When people say, and people overlook this, they think, oh yeah, the knowledge for sustainable development is out there. You know, Greta Thunberg would say the science is there, the knowledge is there. I'm not quite sure about that. I think there's actually quite a lot of work to do to get from the basic science into quite delineated science and information and knowledge for sustainable development into each level of schooling and each level of university courses and lifelong learning. So, you know, rethinking curriculum is not an easy task, but that's one of the things he talks about. Transforming education systems themselves, again, this is not easy, right? In terms of the nature of your schools. Schools should have green spaces if you want to understand how to live with nature. Schools can't be just in urban areas or in concrete buildings. Students and teachers have to have more agency in determining what goes into curriculum, what's the correct context, what's the right application in this type of knowledge. And then finally, which I will come to in a second, you know, digital access, connectivity, and what we could do in terms of a technology transformation for sustainable development, which is going to be the main focus in a second. And then the last thing he talks about is finance for education for this transformation. And he pointed out a statistic that, you know, in rich countries, on average, we spend about $8,000 per student per year in education. And in the poor countries, low-income countries, it's only about $50. So comparing $8,000 in PPP to $50 in corrected for purchasing power parity. So that just shows you the lack of investment in people. And that's the people who are getting educated, never mind the people who are not getting educated. So there has to be a very big transformation of what percentage of overseas development aid and philanthropic money goes to education. It's extremely low. What percentage of the public spend goes on education? How can we harness public-private partnerships in education? So there's a lot to do with financing for education. So that's Guterres' vision statement, and it's worth reading. I only gave you the essence of it. In terms of the summit itself, what came out of the summit, I'm not going to go through the 3 days, you know, but what I am going to say is that it's worth going to the website and having a look at the 6 calls to action. Okay, so, and I'm going to go into detail on the digital one, but you can look at the 6 calls for action. And to see, and this, as I said, is a 2-year, it's going to be a pathway to 2030. And there's 2 years of work plans up to the Summit of the Future in 2024. They did make an announcement about a financing facility for education that Gordon Brown announced, and I'll let you have a look at that. I think there's a lot of fundraising to happen, but at least there's a facility and ambition and some support for actually getting finance for transforming education. And then there was an announcement about gateways to public digital learning, which I'm going to go into in a bit of detail. But all of this is overseen by a high-level committee, a high-level steering committee in UNESCO, and you can actually read about that here. If you go again to TESS and you look at what exactly they do and their plans and their roadmap to 2030, it's worth looking at. So these were the action points, talking about education and crisis situations. So we're talking about refugees, and for example, digital learning, which I'm going to talk about, and this idea of a public digital learning environment, you know, like a commons or a global commons in terms of publicly owned and easily, freely accessible to all. And then there's issues around advancing gender, advancing learning, and financing, and so on. And so these are actions that there was commitments from governments, and there was actions coming out of the tracks and the working groups on these. But I'm just going to focus in on digital learning. So digital learning, first of all, we must harness the power of digital revolution to ensure quality education is provided as a public good and human right. So this is a theme, the idea of a public good and human right, and leave no one behind. So this is the challenge, and this is the challenge I had in my Horizons magazine, that in a sense, knowledge is a global public good, and it should be accessible by everyone, and it's really a human right that you get access to this knowledge, and you get access to education. So when you marry knowledge with teacher training and with your own agency, you turn that into what's called wisdom. So this is what needs to happen, and this is a human right for people, right? And of course, the UN like to say, look, this is aligned with the common agenda of the General Secretary. It's aligned with his roadmap for digital cooperation. It's aligned with this is the UNICEF Declaration of Connectivity on the Internet, etc., and the International Commission on the Futures of Education. So everything that's said here, in some ways, has been articulated in those other UN meetings and outcome documents. So just to look at the 3 keys to unlock the power of digital teaching and learning. So one is content, which I've already talked about a bit. And this is, you know, we have to have high level. How do we ensure quality? How do we ensure that we have curriculum on the SDGs? And how do we make that available to all students, learners, teachers, and caregivers on platforms, on digital platforms? Okay, so that's content. So this is the idea that I guess a lot of people in COVID understood the brilliance of having connectivity, and teachers on a particular learning system could provide you your lessons, they could provide you your homeworks, correct your homeworks, etc. And a lot of people said, well, people with disability didn't have that. People in low-income countries didn't have that. So COVID really emphasized the problem of the digital divide, but also the problem of not having the content online, and not being ready for high content curriculum in a digital format on open learning systems. Okay. The second sort of key or enabler is capacity, and this is to use digital technology to improve learning, to ensure teachers, learners, and other education stakeholders have the skills and knowledge to leverage digital tools for learning, using evidence-based approaches, etc. So this is the idea that when you have knowledge, that gives you great opportunities. It's like in the SDG Academy, we know we have these open education resources, but now we're working on professional training of corporates, professional training of teachers, professional training of people in academia and in governments. We also can use them for micro masters and micro bachelors and master's degrees, and this is what we're doing. So we realize once you have the resources, that can be then translated into training, right? And obviously pedagogy, how you actually the methods of which you train people and make people learn, etc. So this is the whole, supply side thing. Is you have to have schools, buildings, yeah. You have to have curriculum, but then you have to train the teachers. And some people forget about this. And of course, who trains the teachers? It's the teacher training colleges and universities. So having universities is vital, even in this step, okay? And it's also, will show you, it's going to be vital for the learning platforms and content as well. The last key is connectivity. We do have this 50-50 divide in the world where 50% of the population cannot get online. And obviously, any digital revolution kind of counts on mobile compatibility or some connection to these platforms and resources. What I would say is that the digital divide is not as simple as who's online, who's offline, in the sense that if you have Department of Education and you have teachers and you've got schools online who can download these resources, and then with extension services, they can photocopy, they can go old school, they can photocopy, and they can hand them out, or they can bring them to rural villages or bring them where they have to bring them. You can still get a lot of the high quality resources very close to the people who need them. And then you can go old school, and particularly if they're free, they can take them and print them and distribute them. So the digital divide is, from a household perspective, is 50-50. But if you think of it from the school or the supply side of education, it's not 50-50 in the sense that most schools can get to a regional centre, can get to a library or go back into a university and can download these resources, and they can use them and distribute them. So in terms of these 3 keys, there was also 6 commitments associated with these. These are commitments from stakeholders and from governments. And you can have a look at it here. I won't read out too much of it, but so this is the idea, is that we do need to have this public digital learning platform with high quality curriculum aligned education resources, ensuring they are free, open and accessible for all, in line with UNESCO's recommendation on open education. So the OER recommendation from UNESCO is a very powerful tool. And again, I should have had the link here, but you should go into UNESCO, look for the OER recommendation. And when you see it, it actually is it doesn't just talk about really, free open education resources, but it shows you the role of government mandates, the role of different stakeholders, and so on, the legal frameworks, and so on and so forth. So it's actually a very rich document, and a UNESCO recommendation is as close to a legal instrument as you can get. So it's not quite the Paris Agreement, but it's actually very close to a legal instrument. And governments have committed to this. So all governments in the world have committed to OERs, or open education resources, at all levels of schoolings. So in other words, education resources should be free. And we all know that a lot of education resources are not free. They're in the hands of the private sector, in publishing companies. And we all know that school books change their versions every year and charge the price again for the same school books year on year. So this is a big commitment to make education resources free. And they're not just online resources, but also offline resources should be free. We commit to ensuring these platforms empower teachers. So this is the idea that they can be used for teacher training and professional training. And obviously, the idea here is these platforms should be looking to reach to the poorest of the poor, or to leave no one behind. So, a lot of people in refugee camps, people with disability, minority groups, different types of languages, etc. There is no reason why they should be left behind, and there is a commitment to looking at a platform like this and ensuring that that happens. Commit to universal digital literacy. So this is the idea of just training people up on technology and building people's capacity in technologies, etc. And we're all learning that in COVID. We're all upskilling in our digital conferencing, on our digital learning systems, and so on and so forth. And then there's the commitment to connectivity. This is obviously to try to get the cables in, get the internet in as close as you can to all the learning facilities. And this is the whole idea of a whole of government approach to the UNICEF GIGA, which is again about getting the right policies, regulations, and structures and financing to make sure that connectivity is indeed safe and sustainable and equitable, because this is cybersecurity and so on and so forth, right? So there, the 6 commitments on the 3 enablers or keys on this track 4 are on this digital innovation. So I did talk about Secretary General's press. It's not actually a press release; it's a vision statement. And in the vision statement, he did talk about the digital revolution for the benefit of public, again, global public education. And he, as I said, he just to show you again, he highlights the 3 keys for digital learning: connectivity, capacities, and content. And I'm not going to go through them again, but he clearly then, these are the key levers in the digital revolution for transforming education. So just to talk a little bit about what SDG Academy did at the pre-summit and we did at the actual solutions day and test. So a group of us, going back to the UN Sustainable, what's called the Science, Technology, Innovation Forum, or STI Forum. The STI Forum is essentially about how do you transfer technology across nations. Like, so if you look at if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Report, which is the Science Policy Interface report, and it talks about how do we actually get the technology and science to actually reach a safe operating space for humanity. Again, they stress that we've got to disseminate knowledge across countries. It's a bit like the COVID vaccine should have been a global public good. We should have disseminated that right across regions, and same goes for the technologies for climate, for food, for water, etc., etc. The thing we're nearly done. So the thing that we focused on was how is knowledge carried, and how can we carry that on a digital highway? And the thing we looked at was the repositories and libraries, through the UN library system across countries, through university libraries, through public libraries. And we made the case that really we should start looking at the role of libraries in terms of disseminating knowledge across the world, right? We took this on to the pre-summit, and we talked about how you'd create these fair, what's called findable, accessible, eruptible resources, reusable, what's called open access resource repositories, and how they could be functioned with some digital innovations and partnerships. And this again was crystallizing the idea that it is possible for academics and governments and people in technology to work with libraries to actually see whether we could harness these repositories and actually create knowledge for SDGs that could be disseminated quite easily across libraries and into, obviously, different stakeholders and into education systems. And finally, Solutions Day, we called it implementing the UNESCO Open Education Resource, the OER recommendation, through our partnerships. So this was hosted by the Ministry of Ireland, or the Mission of Ireland to UN, the Mission of Ghana. We also had UN Academic Impact, UNESCO, the UN Library, SDG Academy, and folks in Mission 4.7. And again, we made the case that if you want a public platform that can actually disseminate knowledge, and particularly OER, Open Education Resources, you should look to building on the technology inside libraries, and that it's a great opportunity to be able to disseminate work around the world, to have it easily updated, translated, reused, and to disseminate it into different stakeholders. But you can go to that session again, because obviously it's in common room, it's in conference room 4 in the UN, and it's all recorded, and you can get it on the TEST website. So I'm going to stop talking now and see if there's some questions. This is the team in the SDG Academy. These are some of our partners and donors. You'll see this in our annual report. And this is our social media if you want to contact us on our different websites and social media handles. So I'm going to finish here, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh, for this very interesting presentation. And now I will ask you a few questions from our followers. One of the most important outputs of the Transforming Education Summit was the creation of an international financial facility for education in the amount of $2 billion. This amount is less than 1% of the annual profits of the four giant companies Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. Since the start of the war between Russia and Ukraine, US military aid to Ukraine has reached $16 billion. How do you see this funding in light of these numbers?
Yeah, so I think in a broader context, okay, so um, there's a thing called the Global Peace Index. I don't know whether you know this, and it's produced out of Geneva, and it reported a couple of days ago. And they do a very good job in terms of ranking countries by militarization and securitization. And they do a lower bound of about 18 trillion, 18 trillion dollars goes to militarization and securitization. So humans, obviously we need police forces. We probably need a certain amount of protection. Um, but in terms of for cybersecurity, etc., um, somehow out of the $100 trillion economy that we live in, 15% of it is going towards military and securitization. And this is problematic. So if you think of what military and securitization is about, it's about humans basically protecting each other from other humans for their security and for the integrity of their boundaries and etc. So so rather than trying to live with each other in peace and understand each other, we actually are afraid of other humans, and this is how much we're spending, right? The thing we're not realizing is that we're actually there's a bigger war on nature. Like we've already, in terms of ocean health and climate change and our food systems, and biodiversity, etc., they are in tatters. Humanity has declared a massive war on nature. And of course, this is our life support system, right? And the irony is, for us to actually achieve peace and achieve pathways to sustainable development goals, Jeffrey Sachs and the IMF and others who have looked at how much, what's the financing gap with sustainable development, they say it's about 3 to 5 trillion. That's what it is. It's not 15. So to actually secure a safe operating space for us, for all humans and all species, and to look after nature, it's only a fraction of the cost and money that we're putting into military and security. So it is one of the aims of the General Secretary that we really have to put an emphasis on pathway to peace, and we really have to put an emphasis on reorientating that finance away from militarization and securitization and put it towards sustainable development. But within sustainable development, we've got to understand that at the moment, like say overseas development aid, the commitment of overseas development aid is 0.7 of GDP, and only 3 or 4 countries actually have anything like 0.7 of their GDP allocated to overseas development aid. I think the global average for OECD or rich countries is 0.3, and this only amounts to about 230 billion, right? Now, within that context, having the global facility putting on education, putting 2 billion, it looks like it's trying to at least put some of overseas development aid or some of the commitment of rich countries towards transforming education. But the reality is that this is pennies. And when we think about the need to reform curriculum and the systems to get everyone into school, in Ireland, for example, where I am from, all of us, 80% of people, particularly females, go to some form of higher education, like 80%. When I look at this in sub-Saharan Africa, it's only a fraction of 1%. right? We have such a deficit in access to education and such a deficit in the continuum of education at all levels. And now we have to transform it for education. But the reason why we're talking about transforming education, though, is to try not only with access, but to get people to learn the right things, have an appetite for peace, empathy for other people, understand how we live with nature, and so on. So I absolutely agree with you. We could look at the top five, the top five publishing companies in the world have profits of about 5 billion. And this is intellectual property that academics gave away and they're making money on by selling back to libraries and selling back to governments. We have to get much smarter here, right? We cannot be giving away our intellectual capital. We have to put open license on it. We have to actually make it free and distribute it for free. And if people use it for commercial use, we have to get royalties on it, right? So there has to be ways that we can generate our own money. There has to be ways that we can get the private sector involved, et cetera, et cetera. So there are innovative solutions here. But I absolutely agree with you that given that every government and every stakeholder and everyone around the world says education is so important, we are not putting the money where our voice is. There is we are not.
Thank you so much. Another question. Knowledge is not always free to access or oriented to the public good. Open science for the SDGs needs to be embedded in higher education institutions as a norm, as you said in your slides. But in many developing countries, you must pay to access quality because the best institutions are private. How to deal with this situation?
Yeah. So UNESCO's, I think it's called monitoring report in 21-22 is very much focused on the delivery of education by public and what they call non-government actors. Let's call it the private sector. And we all know that when we go into countries, the religious have schools like Catholic schools in our country. There's public schools, there's private schools in terms of delivery. And of course, when you think of parents, education is freedom. Like, in a sense, if you do come from low income and you can take your kids and they can go to school and they go to good schools and get into universities and into good jobs, there's a lot of evidence to say that the return to education in terms of your living standards and your quality of life is very, very high. So many people make gargantuan sacrifices so that their children can have a better life than they did. And they put everything into schooling and into progression in schooling. The problem is, even with this, and particularly this intensity of focusing on school is higher in middle to low income countries, even compared to high income countries. So this is highly unfair, though, because clearly we should be able, if we are serious about education as a human right and access to knowledge as a human right, we have to work much harder in ensuring, and this is universities as well with the resources they have, to actually make sure that education is free and that access to books and worksheets and all the exams and all of these education resources should be free. And in fact, some of the librarians gave examples where they avoided copyright issues and they took what's called preprints and put them up in their repositories, and they had them free for people. And you have people who are not going to school but come into the public library, get the education resources, do the state exams, and they can get into university. And just shows you the importance of free resources. So that's a bit of a Goodwill Hunting, if you know that movie story, kind of saying, like, having access to knowledge and even just those books and worksheets and state exams, you don't even need a teacher, you don't even need a school, because some smart people can actually just learn themselves, and that's how important open education resources are. Obviously, it's preferable to go to school, and obviously, it's preferable to have good teachers and good training for exams, etc. But open education resources should be there. So my personal view on this is that I think, given that you're trying to set values and you're trying to say it's a human right, I think the onus is on the government to ensure there's schools and they're free and resources are free. You'll always get the private sector coming in, and you can go to a nicer school with a nicer uniform that offers, extracurricular activities like dramas and, soccer and rugby and all these other things. So you can always get add-ons. But the basics in terms of a good quality of education, access to education, a good teacher, that should be there for everyone. There has to be a floor established for education for everyone on the planet. And I think this should be delivered by government.
Thank you. The last question: between those who see digital transformation as the key solution to all educational problems and those affected by digital phobia, how do you objectively view digital transformation?
Yeah, so this is so I do think we do have an issue. Hopefully I'm answering your question properly, right? So, like, obviously it's like me. I think for the first time in my life, I had a business card when I went to the Transforming Education Summit, and I got it printed out in New York, and I had this cardboard business card, and I was going to give it out for the first time in my life. And then I met this group of young people, and instead of giving business cards, they were tapping their phones because they could exchange their digital information by just tapping their phone. And so I look like a very old person with my traditional business card. And I know a lot of teachers say, like in my time when I was teaching, and I was a maths teacher for economics, I used to teach on the blackboard with chalk. And I said the best way to learn maths is to watch me teaching maths with chalk on board and let me go equation by equation. And the best way is to, be in a class with 4 or 5 people who could ask me questions and who could do an exercise and come back to me. There's a lot of people who are very stuck in that traditional way. The reality is that, anything that can be done in that sort of face-to-face and physical and traditional way can be done digitally, but you have to be just very open to the technology and the new ways of doing things and the new ways of achieving the same outcomes. The only thing I'd say, the only difference between that traditional way and the digital way is that digitally you can go to scale. As Jeffrey Sachs says at the Solution Day, the marginal cost, the setup cost of digital learning is not small, but the marginal cost is free, in the sense that it's there for everyone can get it, and everyone can use it at scale. And unfortunately, we're in an existential crisis. We've got to get people to school, people learning about sustainable development, people going back to school. And in a sense, the traditional way is going to be too slow. We have to go to scale. And technology and open source technology is the way forward to have that sort of explosion in the access to knowledge and learning that you actually need. And of course, you'll always have the face-to-face and live sessions, and you have to have feedback, etc. But I would say that with the right regulatory frameworks and oversights and the right sort of training, the digital platforms and digital learning can be every bit as good as traditional methods, and that people should be just open to them. And of course, those who are against the digital transformations can be very into the hybrid, so they might stay traditional in some aspects, but they're quite happy to go digital in other aspects, and that's good as well. So hopefully I've answered your questions there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh, for your excellent contribution to this webinar. and for your relevant answers to the questions. And I hope to be able to welcome you in Morocco soon.
Yeah, no, Morocco's a lovely country. I was there during the Human Development Days, and I look forward to going back again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for everyone
Goodbye.
for joining. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.